Welcome back everybody, it's Crazy Welder. In today's video I wanted to get back and give everybody an update on the miniature server that I've been working on for quite some time. I've just been really busy, also kind of doing some other stuff in life and working on some other projects, so I figured this one kind of went by the wayside for a little bit, but I have gotten some work done on it and there are a couple of pretty big updates. So first and foremost, as you can see now, I've gotten some of the wiring done on the PSU to be able to attach the kind of really long extensions down into these connectors here for providing the PC power for the CPU and also just providing the power for the motherboard, as well as just kind of basic connectors. And you can see I've trimmed down what would have otherwise been a 24 pin connector down into this 4 pin, which is what this particular motherboard uses. Now obviously the wiring will still need to get kind of cut down and cleaned up so that it's not the mess that it currently is today, but that will happen, you know, at some point down the road. I'll just need to figure out kind of what the component spacing is all like and which exact way the routing of the wires is going to go. I don't know just yet, so currently that one's kind of an in-progress step. But the other really important piece here, I'll show you guys in a minute, is what's happened for the cooling on the power supply for this particular case. So as you can see now, with the power supply removed down in this corner here, I've drilled holes for basically two 80 mil fans, and those are going to be blowing air upwards onto the power supply, and then basically it's going to be exhausting out the top of the case and sort of out the sides as well, allowing the PSU to get some really nice kind of cool air, but at the same time also basically not have a 40 mil fan that sounds like a really whiny, really loud server fan, cooling it down, which in a lot of cases, in the case of this particular power supply, has been noted by a number of reviewers that it's actually not adequate enough to cool it once it's really going kind of full tilt. What you also notice is I've taken the power supply out of its casing, so it's going to remain as a kind of open power supply, so kind of open deck if you will, or open case power supply, and that will allow it to also kind of vent to the atmosphere as well for some additional cooling. And it's mainly really for the fitment. The fitment was just not going to work with the case surrounding the power supply. However, now that I've kind of trimmed that down, it's going to be a lot better. I still need to make some modifications to some of the internal power supply cooling to allow it to actually fully fit within the case, but as it stands, that's kind of where we're at right now. Now, what I'll also show you guys in a second here, after I move all of this stuff out of the way, is what I did for the fans on the radiator as well. Alright, so as you guys can see, I flipped it all over so you can see exactly what's going on. I still haven't cleared out the markings for the Sharpie where I wanted the fans to be placed, but as you can see, I've also drilled holes for the 120 mil slim fans that are going to be cooling this radiator. I'll put the fans that I used in the link of the description of the video so you can see essentially what I've used. They're really slim fans, but they're also high pressure fans. So even though they are kind of on the slimmer side, they still provide enough pressure to flow air through this guy and then basically exhaust it out the top of the case. So there's going to be intake at the bottom, exhaust out the top. And same thing you can see for the Reven fans that are 80 mil, so two of them in a row at the bottom cooling the power supply. There is unfortunately no room for them inside of the case. I was really hoping I would be able to mount them on the inside, but unfortunately outside is the only way that they will be able to fit in the case of this particular kind of computer case that I'm using. So it's just going to have to stay like this, but I'm just going to get some slightly taller feet to account for the extra height, as these particular fans are slightly longer than the 80 mil feet that are on this particular case standard. So because of that, you know, essentially I won't be able to mount them, or I should say they're actually 8 millimeters, the feet themselves, and they just got in the way of a lot of the components that are in here, getting in the way of the cooling and the fans, as well as the radiator mounting. So it just wasn't really going to work out. I needed to replace the feet anyhow at some point down the road, but it doesn't matter because it's not really going to add that much additional height to this particular unit. It's still going to look and work just fine. And functionality wise, and in terms of the noise, having these two fans basically cooling the power supply is going to not only allow it to perform better, but also going to allow it to run a little bit cooler and basically have the noise levels be fairly manageable. It's not going to sound like a really loud server going off every time this thing turns on, as I would prefer to have it running for at least 5 or 6 hours a day, just kind of in the background in my room and in a space that's fairly open. So I'm not really going to have any kind of an enclosure for it. As such, it's going to need to be as quiet as possible while also maintaining a good level of performance. Now, next steps, obviously, after mainly the wiring is done, is of course figuring out the cooling situation with the ducts, allowing me to essentially liquid cool the CPU socket right there, and it's going to be the only component that's liquid cooled in here. And the other part that I'm still working on is figuring out essentially a pump / reservoir solution, because I initially wanted to do just a pump and have no reservoir, but now I'm starting to think that because I do have a very hot CPU that's going to be running in this particular computer with 48 cores, I'm going to need to have a little bit of an extra buffer before this thing ultimately kind of heats up and ends up soaking the radiator and heat soaks it so that the system basically starts to underperform. So having at least a little bit more water gives me a slightly longer buffer time before everything starts to heat up to a fairly decent degree, and at that point I'll also be able to get everything squared away. Right now I am really interested in making essentially a PCI bracket that's going to slot into the back of where this case is, and then that PCI bracket is going to have essentially a acrylic kind of reservoir in it with a pump mounted at the bottom, and then that will obviously have 2 connections coming in and out to allow it to run some cooling. And I may possibly have 2 external inputs into it to allow potentially an additional radiator for additional cooling should the main system not be adequate enough, or if I end up going somewhere where I need just a little bit more performance and can spare the room. But otherwise, I'm hoping to have a kind of all-in-one unit that lives on the PCI bracket to allow it to essentially very quickly slide in and out of this case with quick disconnects, so I can easily change and replace the fluid in there should I need to, and also so that I can ultimately basically have, again, better cooling within this case, or at least a longer time before the system fully heat soaks. So again, those are kind of the next main primary steps after all the wiring is squared away, and after I've gotten the power supply again modified just a little bit more so that I am actually able to get it to a stage where everything connects and is able to run pretty much continuously without any glitches, etc. I still have not gotten my CPU as well. That's another one kind of on the list right now. So waiting on the CPU, I do need to get some more funds before I plunk down the 3K that's going to cost me to get it into my hands. And I'm also waiting on a graphics card for this guy at some point down the road. In the meantime, I'm going to be using a very basic kind of Nvidia card in there just to get the system operational so I can see what's going on and be able to have some kind of video output in here. But at some point it's going to have a workstation GPU in there, and it's going to be a single slot card, so essentially the same size as the basically PCIe disk adapter, and that way I'm going to have still plenty of room in here, even though it's going to still run fairly warm, but at the same time I will have a full-length GPU in there doing the additional heavy lifting when I'm doing video renders, etc. And of course that will also help when I'm doing some CAD work on this workstation as well, so it will give me just a little bit of a beefier setup in terms of what I'll be able to do with it. Now, the other kind of concern with this GPU is going to be the cooling, so I will probably have to figure out some kind of custom cooling solution for the card. Again, I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work. There's not a whole lot of space in here, so I will need to get pretty creative in terms of the layout and the setup of how that's going to look and run. But I'm pretty sure I should be able to cross that bridge once we get to the point where that is going to become a necessity. And most likely is going to be another 3D printed part that allows the air to be pulled in, probably somewhere from the top of the case, and then blow over into the inside of the shroud, and then blowing it out basically externally. So that is kind of the plan, you guys, and the quick updates on the home server that I've been building. So look out for more videos in this series. It'll probably be a little while before I post another one on this topic again, as I do want to make a bit more headway before I kind of show some additional footage of this thing running. Ideally, I will have at the very least the CPU in there and some very basic water cooling hooked up so that I can actually have this thing running and see what the performance is like to get a baseline, basically using, you know, kind of more or less standardized connectors. And then once I get the plenum set up for this and 3D printed, I should be able to do another test and see how much the performance drops off, because obviously having a bunch of 90-degree connectors in here is going to reduce water flow by a certain amount and potentially reduce the cooling effectiveness of this kind of device. But again, since that is a very beefy kind of copper heatsink on there, I would assume that it's still not going to affect it too much. But again, we shall see once we cross that bridge. In any case, you guys, that is going to be it for this video. Stay tuned for the next one in the series, and I'll see you all soon.